I hope she's not black. The words slipped from Alexander Thorne's lips before he could stop them, whispered to his reflection in the antique mirror of the chapel's preparation room. His hands trembled as he adjusted his platinum cufflinks, the same ones his grandfather wore to his own arranged marriage 70 years ago. What did you just say? Alexander spun around to find his younger sister Victoria standing in the doorway, her face twisted with disgust. She'd heard everything. Victoria, I didn't mean. Didn't mean what, Alex? Didn't mean to reveal exactly what kind of man you really are. Her voice carried the kind of cold fury that could cut glass. Today is supposed to be about healing our family's reputation, and you're standing there hoping your bride isn't the wrong color. Alexander's throat constricted. The weight of 4 generations of Thorne family expectations pressed down on his shoulders like lead. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Father made it very clear what kind of marriage would be acceptable. Father's been dead for 3 years, Alexander. These are your words. Your thoughts. Victoria stepped closer, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. Do you even know her name? The question hit him like a physical blow. Of course I know her name. It's... He faltered. In all the months of negotiations between their family's lawyers, through all the financial arrangements and property discussions, no one had mentioned her name. She was simply the Wakefield daughter. A strategic asset. A peace offering between 2 warring dynasties. You don't, do you? Victoria's laugh was hollow. You're about to marry a woman whose name you don't even know, and your biggest concern is her race. What has this family done to you? Before Alexander could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them. Mr. Thorne, it's time. Alexander's heart hammered against his ribs. Through the chapel's stone walls, he could hear the murmur of 300 guests, the most powerful families in the country, all gathered to witness this union that was supposed to end decades of bitter rivalry between the Thornes and Wakefields. The marriage that would merge 2 financial empires and supposedly heal old wounds. But what wounds, exactly? No one had ever explained the source of the hatred between their families. It was simply accepted fact, Thornes and Wakefields didn't mix. Until today. Alex. Victoria grabbed his arm, her nails digging. The chapel doors opened, and Alexander found himself walking down a marble aisle lined with faces he recognized from business magazines and society pages. But he wasn't looking at them. His gaze was fixed on the figure standing at the altar, draped in ivory silk, her face hidden behind an intricate lace veil. His bride, whose name he didn't know, whose face he'd never seen, whose family had been his family's enemy for reasons no one would explain. As he took his place beside her, Alexander caught a glimpse of her hands, elegant, dark-skinned fingers adorned with vintage gold rings. His stomach dropped. His whispered fear was about to become reality. The officiant began speaking, but the words blurred together. Alexander's mind raced through everything that had led to this moment. The late-night meetings with lawyers, his grandfather's insistence that this marriage was necessary for the family's survival, the mysterious debts and legal troubles that had suddenly appeared after his father's death. The bride will now lift her veil, the officiant announced. This was it. The moment that would determine his future, his family's future, and possibly the course of 2 business empires. Delicate fingers reached up to grasp the lace edges. Alexander held his breath, his grandfather's voice echoing in his mind. The Wakefields cannot be trusted, boy. They've been trying to destroy us for 50 years. This marriage is our only way to control them. The veil lifted. Alexander's world stopped. The woman standing before him was breathtakingly beautiful, rich brown skin that seemed to glow in the chapel's candlelight, intelligent dark eyes that held depths he couldn't fathom, and a face that belonged in Renaissance paintings. But it wasn't just her beauty that stole his breath. It was the look of complete and utter devastation that crossed her features the moment their eyes met. She knew. Somehow, she knew exactly what he'd been thinking, what he'd been hoping, what kind of man he really was. And in that moment of recognition, Alexander realized something that would change everything. He knew her face, not from photographs or society pages, but from a memory buried so deep he'd almost forgotten it existed. A memory from 20 years ago, when he was 8 years old and had wandered away from his nanny in Central Park. A memory of falling into the lake and being pulled out by a little girl with the same dark eyes, the same kind smile, who'd sat with him until help arrived. The same little girl his grandfather had dragged him away from, furious that he'd been consorting with their kind. The same little girl he'd never been allowed to see again. Standing at the altar, staring into the eyes of his arranged bride, Alexander Thorne realized he was about to marry the first person who'd ever saved his life, and possibly the only person who could save him from the man he'd become. But as her expression shifted from devastation to something far more dangerous, a cold, calculating fury that made his blood run cold, Alexander understood that salvation might be the last thing on her mind. "Do you, Alexander James Thorne, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The question hung in the air like a blade. 300 guests waited. 2 families' futures balanced on his answer. And the woman before him, whose name he still didn't know, watched him with eyes that promised either redemption or complete destruction. Alexander opened his mouth to speak, unaware that his next words would unleash secrets that had been buried for 50 years, and that by the end of this day, everything he thought he knew about his family, her family, and the war between them would be revealed as an elaborate lie constructed to hide a truth so devastating it could destroy them all. "I do." The words left Alexander's mouth before his brain could catch up, driven by something deeper than conscious thought. The woman before him, his wife now, didn't flinch, but he caught the barely perceptible tightening around her eyes. "You may kiss the bride." Alexander leaned forward, his hands trembling as they found her waist. She was real, solid, warm beneath the silk. As their lips met in what should have been a perfunctory kiss, she whispered something so quietly only he could hear. "I remember you too, little boy who couldn't swim." The kiss lasted exactly 3 seconds, but it shattered 20 years of carefully constructed walls. When they broke apart, Alexander saw something flicker in her expression, not the cold fury from moments before, but a flash of the kind 8-year-old who'd risked her own safety to save a stranger. The chapel erupted in polite applause as they turned to face their audience. Alexander's grandfather, Harrison Thorne, sat in the front row, his weathered face carved into a satisfied smile that made Alexander's skin crawl. Beside him, Alexander's mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, though whether from joy or grief was impossible to tell. On the bride's side, an elegant older woman sat with perfect posture, her own expression unreadable. But Alexander noticed how her hands gripped her purse with white-knuckled intensity, and how her eyes never left her daughter's face with what looked like desperate concern. As they walked back down the aisle, Alexander's bride kept her smile perfectly composed, but he felt her hand trembling in his. "What's your name?" he whispered urgently. "Seriously." Her voice was soft but sharp. "We just got married and you don't know my name." Heat flooded his cheeks. "The lawyers handled everything." "I never." "Rain." Her voice softened just slightly. "Rain Wakefield." "Well, Rain Thorne now, I suppose." Rain. The name fit her perfectly, and Alexander found himself repeating it silently as they reached the chapel doors. Outside, photographers swarmed like vultures, their flashes creating a strobe-light nightmare as the newly married couple posed for pictures that would grace the society pages tomorrow. "Smile," Rain murmured through her teeth. "We're performing now." The reception was held at the Thorne family estate, a sprawling mansion that had been in the family for 4 generations. As they moved through the receiving line, Alexander watched Rain navigate the social minefield with practiced grace, accepting congratulations from people who'd probably crossed the street to avoid her family just yesterday. Quite a surprise, isn't she? Alexander turned to find James George, his father's oldest friend and the family's chief financial advisor, holding 2 glasses of champagne. James had been like an uncle to Alexander growing up, the one adult who'd actually listened to his dreams of becoming a teacher instead of inheriting the family business. "What do you mean?" Alexander accepted the champagne, grateful for something to do with his hands. James glanced around, then leaned closer. "Your grandfather never mentioned she was black." "I'm shocked. Usually Harrison's quite specific about his preferences." The casual racism hit Alexander like a slap. "James. Oh, don't get me wrong. She's lovely. Educated at Cambridge, speaks 4 languages, runs 3 nonprofits. Much more impressive than most of the vapid socialites your grandfather usually parades through here." James sipped his champagne. "Still, it's quite the departure from family tradition." Alexander's stomach twisted. "You've researched her?" "Of course. Due diligence. The Wakefield family is fascinating. Old money, older than yours actually. Made their fortune in shipping and later tech. But here's the interesting part." James's voice dropped to a whisper. "Their daughter has been running point on several investigations into corporate fraud, specifically targeting companies that engaged in discriminatory practices." The glass slipped from Alexander's fingers, shattering on the marble floor. Several guests turned to look, but James smoothly guided him away from the mess. Careful, Alexander. Wouldn't want anyone to think you're nervous about something. But Alexander was nervous. More than nervous, he was terrified. Because pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed were starting to fall into place. His father's mysterious death. The sudden financial troubles. The urgent need for this marriage. James, what aren't you telling me? James's expression shifted, becoming almost paternal. Your father was a good man, Alexander, but he made some choices near the end that put the family at risk. This marriage isn't just about ending the feud, it's about survival. The Wakefields have evidence that could destroy us completely. Evidence of what? Let's just say your grandfather's business practices in the 1980s weren't always legal. And your father may have continued some of those practices. James placed a hand on Alexander's shoulder. But don't worry. Your new wife's family wants this scandal buried as much as we do. That's why they agreed to the marriage. Mutually assured destruction, as they say. Alexander felt the world tilt beneath his feet. You're saying this marriage is blackmail. I'm saying it's salvation. For both families. James smiled that same paternal smile. Now go find your wife. She's been talking to her mother for 10 minutes, and they both look ready to bolt. Alexander pushed through the crowd, his mind reeling. Everything he'd believed about this marriage, about his family, about himself, was crumbling. When he finally spotted Rain, she was indeed deep in conversation with her mother near the garden doors. Both women had the same tensed posture of caged animals looking for escape routes. As he approached, he caught fragments of their urgent whispers. Can't go through with this, Mama. Did you see his face when I lifted the veil? He looked like I was his worst nightmare come true. Baby, listen to me. We don't have a choice. If we don't honor this agreement. I know about the files, about what they are holding over us. But there has to be another way. There isn't. The older woman's voice was firm but gentle. Your father's mistakes are going to destroy 3 generations of our family's work unless we play this exactly right. And that means making this marriage work. Alexander froze. They were trapped too. This wasn't just his nightmare, it was hers as well. Rain. Both women turned, and Alexander watched his new wife's face transform into a polite mask. Her mother extended a perfectly manicured hand. You must be Alexander. I'm Diana Wakefield. I've heard so much about you. The way she said it made Alexander wonder exactly what she'd heard, and from whom. Diana was an elegant woman in her 50s, with the same intelligent eyes as her daughter and an air of controlled strength that reminded him of a general planning a war. Mrs. Wakefield, I wanted to thank you for. Call me Diana, please. We're family now. Her smile was warm, but her eyes remained calculating. Rain, darling, why don't you show Alexander the gardens? I believe there are some things you two need to discuss privately. It wasn't a suggestion. Alexander found himself following Rain through the French doors onto a stone terrace overlooking his grandmother's prize-winning rose garden. The sun was setting, casting everything in golden light that should have been romantic but instead felt ominous. 20 years, Rain said without preamble, her back to him as she gripped the stone balustrade. 20 years since that day in the park, and this is how we meet again. You saved my life that day. She turned to face him, and in the fading light, Alexander could see tears threatening to spill over. And you've spent every day since then becoming exactly the kind of man who would whisper I hope she's not black before meeting his bride. The words hit him like physical blows. Rain, do you know what I remembered most about that little boy in the park? Her voice was quiet but devastating. How he looked at me. Not like I was different or dangerous or less than. Just like I was another kid who might be a friend. And when your grandfather pulled you away, when he called you back from the undesirable element, that little boy turned around and waved goodbye to me anyway. Alexander's chest tightened. He remembered that wave, remembered his grandfather's furious lecture in the car afterward about appropriate associations and family standards. The police sirens grew louder, and through the estate's iron gates, Alexander could see news vans already setting up like a siege. James George straightened his tie and checked his watch as if he had somewhere important to be. You have approximately 3 minutes before the authorities arrive, he said calmly. I'd suggest you use that time wisely. James, why? Alexander's voice cracked. You were my father's best friend. You've been family to us since I was born. Family? James laughed, but there was no humor in it. Your family destroyed mine, Alexander. Both your families. Did you think actions wouldn't have consequences forever? Rain stepped forward, her hand still gripping Alexander's. What are you talking about? James pulled out his phone and showed them a photograph, a wedding picture from what looked like the 1970s. A young black man in a tuxedo stood beside a radiant white woman in a flowing dress. My parents, James said simply. Robert George and Caroline Wakefield George. The name hit like a thunderbolt. Rain gasped. Caroline Wakefield, that's my great-aunt. She disappeared when my grandmother was young. The family said she died in an accident. She didn't die. She fell in love with a man your family deemed unsuitable. James's voice was perfectly controlled, but Alexander could see decades of rage burning behind his eyes. And when she refused to give him up, both families joined forces to destroy them. Alexander's mind reeled. That's impossible. Our families have been enemies for generations. Have they? James tilted his head. Or is that just the story you were told to hide the truth? The Thorns and Wakefields weren't enemies, Alexander. They were partners. Business partners who worked together to systematically exclude, discredit, and destroy any family member who dared to love outside their acceptable racial boundaries. The sound of car doors slamming echoed from the front of the estate. James glanced toward the noise with satisfaction. They bankrupted my father's business. They had my mother declared mentally incompetent and institutionalized when she tried to fight back. They made sure I grew up in foster care, knowing exactly who I was but never able to prove it. His smile was razor-sharp. But they made one crucial mistake. What mistake? Rain whispered. They kept records. Every dirty deal, every paid-off judge, every life they destroyed. Your grandfather, Harrison, was meticulous about documentation, Alexander. And your great-uncle Andrew, Rain, he was equally thorough. They kept evidence of everything, including the murder of my parents. The word murder hung in the air like a death sentence. Alexander felt the world tilt. Murder. Car accident, the reports said. Brake failure on a mountain road. James's voice was conversational, as if discussing the weather. Except the mechanic who sabotaged the brakes kept receipts. And photographs. And a very detailed confession that he gave to a priest before his own mysterious suicide 3 months later. Through the terrace doors, Alexander could see police officers entering the main hall, their radios crackling. Guests were being directed to remain in the ballroom while the premises were searched. You're insane, Alexander said, but even as the words left his mouth, he was remembering things. His grandfather's obsession with family purity. The way certain names were never mentioned in their house. The mysterious family friend who'd visited every year on the anniversary of his father's death, a visit that always left his grandfather locked in his study for hours. Am I? James pulled out a tablet and swiped to a video file. This is security footage from your grandfather's office, recorded 2 weeks after your father's funeral. The video showed Harrison Thorne sitting across from Diana Wakefield in what was clearly a tense negotiation. The audio was crystal clear. The children must never know the truth about Caroline and Robert, Harrison was saying. If they discover our families worked together to cover up the murders. They won't, Diana interrupted. We'll arrange the marriage exactly as planned. Alexander will marry Rain, thinking it's about ending a generations-old feud. They'll never suspect we created that feud as a cover story. And the George boy. James has been useful, but is becoming a liability. Once the marriage is complete and the evidence is safely buried, we'll deal with him permanently. The video ended. Alexander stared at the blank screen, his entire reality crumbling. Your families didn't just murder my parents, James said quietly. They've been planning to murder me for 20 years. The only reason I'm still alive is because I've been documenting everything, building insurance policies they don't know about. Rain's face had gone ashen. The files my mother mentioned, the evidence that's supposedly protecting us, is actually protecting her from me. She's terrified I'll expose their partnership and the murders. But what she doesn't know is that I've been feeding information to federal investigators for the past 5 years. James smiled. Today's wedding was never about saving your families. It was about gathering everyone in one place so the FBI could arrest them all simultaneously. As if summoned by his words, Agent Sophie Rake appeared in the terrace doorway, flanked by 2 other federal agents. She was a small woman with steel in her eyes and a warrant in her hand. James George, she said formally. Thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. Alexander's brain struggled to process this new reality. You're working with them. I've been working with them since I turned 18 and gained access to my parents' safe deposit box. James handed Agent Rake a USB drive. Everything's on there. 50 years of evidence. Financial records, assassination orders, the names of every judge and politician they bought, every family they destroyed. Agent Rake nodded to her team, and they moved into the house. Through the windows, Alexander could see guests being separated and questioned, his grandfather being read his rights, Diana Wakefield arguing furiously with another agent. "This is impossible," Rain said, but her voice lacked conviction. "My mother would never. She's dedicated her life to helping people." "Has she?" James pulled up another file on his tablet. "Let me show you where the money for those medical foundations really comes from. Spoiler alert, it's not entirely legal." The sound of shouting erupted from inside the house. Harrison Thorne's voice rose above the chaos. "You have no idea what you're doing. That evidence was sealed by court order 30 years ago. Court orders signed by judges you bribed." Agent Rake called back through the open doors. "We've spoken with several of them. Quite a few were eager to cooperate once we explained the charges they'd be facing." Alexander sank onto the stone balustrade, his legs no longer able to support him. "Everything I believed about my family, about myself, was a lie," James confirmed. "But here's the interesting part, Alexander. You're not actually guilty of anything except being naive. Neither is Rain. You're both victims in this, just like my parents were." Rain was staring at her phone, scrolling through news alerts that were updating in real time. The stock prices for both companies just crashed. "We're talking billions in lost value." "Money can be rebuilt," James said. "Lives can't." Agent Rake reappeared on the terrace, her expression grim. "Mr. George, we need you to come with us. There are some details about the timeline we need to clarify." "Of course." James straightened his jacket and turned to Alexander and Rain. "I need you both to understand something. What happens next isn't about revenge anymore. It's about justice. Your families destroyed hundreds of lives over the past 50 years. Not just my parents, but every family member who dared to love someone of a different race, every business partner who refused to participate in their schemes, every whistleblower who tried to expose them." He paused at the terrace doors. "You have a choice to make. You can go down with them, or you can help us make sure this never happens again." As James disappeared into the house with the federal agents, Alexander and Rain found themselves alone on the terrace, surrounded by the wreckage of their wedding day and their family's legacies. "We're married," Rain said suddenly, as if the reality had just hit her. "Legally, yes. Though I suspect that's about to be the least of our problems." Alexander looked at his wife. His wife really looked at her for the first time since the veil had lifted. "I need you to know something, Rain. What I said before the ceremony, what you heard, that wasn't who I want to be. But it was who you were in that moment." The words stung because they were true. "Yes, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to understand how I became that person, and how to become someone better." Rain studied his face for a long moment. "The little boy in the park, he really would have been friends with me, wouldn't he? If circumstances had been different. That little boy would have been honored to know you." Something shifted in the air between them. Not love, it was too soon for that, too complicated. But recognition. Alliance. The understanding that they were both casualties of a war they'd never chosen to fight. "My mother's going to prison," Rain said quietly. "So is my grandfather. Probably my mother too, depending on how much she knew. We'll lose everything. The houses, the businesses, the foundations. Probably." Rain turned to face him fully. "I have a trust fund that my great-aunt Caroline left me. It's been sitting untouched for 15 years because I never knew why she'd left money to a family member I'd never heard of. Now I think I know." Alexander felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. "How much?" "Enough to start over. Enough to build something better than what our families destroyed." Rain held out her hand. "I have a proposal for you, Alexander Thorne. We're already married." "No, we're legally bound by a contract that was signed under false pretenses by people who are about to be arrested for conspiracy and murder. But we could choose to stay married. We could choose to honor the vows we made, even if we made them for the wrong reasons." Alexander stared at her outstretched hand. "Why would you want that? After everything you know about me, about my family." "Because that little boy in the park saved my life too, in a way. He was the first white person who ever looked at me like I mattered. And maybe—" She paused, vulnerability flickering across her face. "Maybe together we can figure out how to become the people we were supposed to be before our families taught us to hate." As police led Harrison Thorne past the terrace windows in handcuffs, as Diana Wakefield was escorted to a waiting car, As their entire world collapsed around them, Alexander reached out and took his wife's hand. "Partners?" he asked. "Partners," she agreed. But as they stood together on the terrace, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the garden shadows. Someone who'd been conspicuously absent from the guest list, someone whose presence would soon reveal that James George's quest for justice was actually an elaborate setup for a revenge plot that would make their family's 50-year war look like a minor disagreement. The real battle was just beginning. The figure in the garden shadows stepped into the moonlight, and Alexander's blood turned to ice. "Hello, Alexander. It's been a long time." Andrew Wakefield emerged from behind the rose bushes, his silver hair gleaming and his expensive suit immaculate despite having apparently been hiding in the garden for hours. Rain's great-uncle, the man who was supposed to be dead, smiled at them both with the serene confidence of someone holding all the cards. "Uncle Andrew." Rain's voice was barely a whisper. "But you died 5 years ago. We went to your funeral. You went to a very expensive performance designed to convince everyone that the most dangerous man in either family was no longer a threat." Andrew brushed an imaginary speck of dirt from his sleeve. "Tell me, darling niece, how did you enjoy your wedding?" Alexander felt Rain's hand tighten in his as the implications crashed over them. "You orchestrated this. All of it." "Not all of it. James George's little revenge fantasy was quite real, though I may have guided certain aspects of his investigation." Andrew walked closer, his footsteps silent on the stone terrace. "The federal agents are real. The evidence is real. Your family's crimes are very, very real. I simply ensured that justice would be served on my timeline." Through the terrace doors, they could see the last of the wedding guests being escorted out by FBI agents. The grand ballroom that had been filled with celebration just hours earlier now looked like a crime scene, complete with evidence bags and photographers documenting everything. "Why?" Rain's voice cracked. "Why fake your own death? Why let our families destroy each other?" Andrew pulled out a leather chair from the terrace's outdoor dining set and sat down as if settling in for a long story. "Because sometimes the only way to kill a cancer is to let it spread until it's visible to everyone. Your families didn't just murder Caroline and Robert George. They've been systematically destroying anyone who threatened their twisted vision of racial purity for 50 years. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder. 37 families, Rain. 37 families destroyed because someone fell in love with the wrong person. Businesses bankrupted, reputations ruined, people driven to suicide, and in at least 6 cases, outright murder made to look like accidents." Alexander's phone buzzed with an incoming call. James George's name appeared on the screen. "Answer it," Andrew said. "Put it on speaker. I believe James has some news for you." With trembling fingers, Alexander accepted the call. "James." "Alexander, thank God. Listen to me very carefully. We have a problem. The evidence I gave the FBI, some of it was fabricated." Rain gasped. Alexander felt the ground shift beneath his feet again. "What do you mean fabricated?" "Someone's been feeding me false information for years. Documents that looked authentic, recordings that seemed real, but when the FBI ran advanced forensic analysis." James's voice was strained. "At least 30% of what I thought was evidence has been digitally manipulated." Andrew smiled and held up a small recording device. "The beauty of modern technology, don't you think? Give a grieving son some real evidence mixed with carefully crafted fiction, and he'll do all the work for you." "James," Alexander said urgently, "where are you right now?" "FBI field office downtown. They are talking about releasing your grandfather and Diana pending further investigation. The case is falling apart, Alexander. Without solid evidence, they can't hold anyone." The call ended abruptly. Andrew slipped the recording device back into his pocket. "You see the predicament," he said conversationally. "Your families are indeed guilty of terrible crimes, but proving it in court just became significantly more difficult. James George has unknowingly compromised his own investigation by presenting fabricated evidence alongside the real evidence." Rain stood up abruptly, pacing to the edge of the terrace. "You're playing with people's lives like they are chess pieces." "Yes, I am. Because that's exactly what your families have been doing for 5 decades. Andrew's voice hardened. "But unlike them, I have an endgame that serves justice rather than profit." Alexander's mind raced through the implications. The FBI will have to start over. Re-examine everything. That could take years. Years during which your families will be free to destroy evidence, silence witnesses, and potentially eliminate threats. Andrew opened the manila folder and spread photographs across the table. including threats like James George, who's already received 2 death threats since arriving at the FBI office. The photographs showed surveillance images of the Thorne and Wakefield estates, but also other locations Alexander didn't recognize. Safe houses, private jets being fueled, bank accounts in foreign countries. They are preparing to run, Rain realized. Your mother has been moving money offshore for weeks, darling. Small amounts, below the radar of federal monitoring. And Alexander, your grandfather has been liquidating assets since your father's funeral. They've been planning this escape route long before James George became a problem. Alexander stared at a photograph of his grandfather shaking hands with a man he recognized as Viktor Kozlov, a Russian oligarch notorious for harboring fugitives from American justice. How do you know all this? Andrew smiled that serene smile again. Because I've been orchestrating it. Every move they've made in the past 3 years has been in response to carefully planted information designed to make them reveal their full network. Tonight wasn't just about arresting them. It was about making them panic enough to activate their entire escape plan so we could document everyone involved. Rain's phone rang. The caller ID showed her mother's number. Answer it, Andrew instructed. But be very careful what you say. Rain's hands shook as she accepted the call. Mama. Baby, listen to me carefully. Don't trust anyone, especially that man George. He's been lying to everyone, including the FBI. You and Alexander need to get out of there right now. Where are you? I'm safe, but not for long. There are people who will kill to keep their secrets buried, and you've become a target just by marrying into this mess. Diana's voice was urgent, frightened. There's a car waiting at the service entrance to the estate. Black sedan, license plate Romeo 779. Get in it and go to the address I'm texting you. The call ended. Seconds later, Rain's phone chimed with a text containing an address in the warehouse district. Andrew clapped slowly. Excellent performance by Diana. Very convincing. She almost sounds like a concerned mother instead of a woman trying to lure her daughter into a trap. What are you talking about? Rain's voice was sharp with panic. The black sedan is real. The address is real. But your mother isn't alone there. She's with a team of mercenaries hired to ensure that both of you disappear permanently. Andrew stood up and walked to the terrace railing. You see, your families have realized that the only way to truly bury this scandal is to eliminate the next generation entirely. Alexander felt sick. They are going to kill us. They are going to try. The official story will be that you were so devastated by the family scandal that you took your own lives in a tragic murder-suicide. Very romantic, very believable, and it eliminates any possibility of you cooperating with future investigations. A sound from inside the house made them all freeze. Footsteps, moving deliberately through the empty ballroom. Someone was in the house who shouldn't be there. Andrew checked his watch. Right on schedule. The cleanup crew has arrived. Cleanup crew. Alexander whispered. The people your families hired to stage your deaths. They should be reaching the terrace in approximately 2 minutes. Andrew pulled out a small black device that looked like a garage door opener. Which is why we're leaving. Now. He pressed the button, and hidden speakers throughout the garden erupted with the sound of police sirens and shouting voices, a recording designed to confuse and misdirect anyone tracking them. There's a tunnel entrance behind the fountain, Andrew said, already moving. Built during Prohibition, recently renovated. It leads to a safe house 3 blocks away. Why should we trust you? Rain demanded, even as she followed him toward the garden. You've admitted to manipulating everyone. Because, my dear niece, I'm the only person in this entire nightmare who actually wants you to survive. Andrew paused at the fountain and did something that caused a section of the base to swing inward, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Your families want you dead. James George's quest for justice has been compromised beyond repair. The FBI's case is collapsing. But I have something none of them possess. What? Andrew smiled, and for the first time since he'd appeared, the expression seemed genuine. The original evidence. The real evidence. The documents Caroline Wakefield George hid before she died, the ones that prove everything. The footsteps in the house were getting closer, and Alexander could hear voices now, calm, professional voices discussing logistics in the way people talk about a job they've done many times before. Target location confirmed. 2 subjects on the terrace. Eliminate on sight, stage as murder-suicide. Alexander grabbed Rain's hand and pulled her toward the tunnel entrance. As they descended into the darkness, Andrew sealed the entrance behind them, plunging them into complete blackness. There are flashlights on the shelf to your right, Andrew said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. But we need to move quickly. They'll discover the tunnel within minutes. As they hurried through the narrow passageway, Alexander found himself pressed close to Rain in the darkness. Despite everything, the terror, the betrayal, the mortal danger, he was acutely aware of her presence beside him. The way she moved with determined grace even in pitch blackness. The way her breathing stayed steady despite the fear he knew she was feeling. "Rain," he whispered, his voice barely audible over their footsteps. "Yeah. When we get out of this, and we will get out of this, I want to start over. Not just the marriage, but everything. I want to be the person who deserves to stand beside you." Her hand squeezed his in the darkness. "We'll figure it out together." But as they reached the end of the tunnel and climbed toward a dim light ahead, neither of them noticed Andrew speaking quietly into a Bluetooth earpiece. Phase 2 is complete. The subjects are contained and moving toward the secondary location. Prepare for Phase 3. Because Andrew Wakefield wasn't just playing chess with their families' lives. He was playing chess with theirs too. And as they emerged from the tunnel into what they thought was safety, they were walking directly into a trap 50 years in the making. One that would force them to choose between saving themselves and saving the hundreds of other victims their families had destroyed. The real game was just beginning. The tunnel led to a basement that looked like a cross between a luxury hotel suite and a military command center. Monitors lined one wall, showing surveillance feeds from dozens of locations. Alexander recognized some of them. His family's estate, the FBI field office, various Wakefield properties. But others were unfamiliar. "Welcome to the nerve center of Operation Caroline," Andrew said, settling into a leather chair behind a bank of computers. "Named after the woman whose murder started this 50-year war." Rain was staring at one of the monitors, her face pale. "That's the safe house where my mother said to meet her. It's surrounded by armed men." "Indeed. Your mother is currently being held at gunpoint, though she doesn't know it yet. She believes she's meeting with the mercenaries she hired to kill you both. Instead, she's about to become evidence in her own murder trial." Alexander moved closer to the screens, his blood chilling as he recognized faces. "Those aren't mercenaries. Those are federal agents." "Very good. Agent Rake's team, to be precise. They never left the area. They've been conducting simultaneous operations all evening." Andrew typed something into his keyboard, and audio began streaming from the warehouse location. Diana Wakefield's voice filled the room. "Where are they? My daughter and her husband should have been here 20 minutes ago. We need you to remain calm. We have reason to believe your daughter and Mr. Thorne are in immediate danger." "Danger? From whom?" "I'm the one who arranged their protection." Agent Rake's voice was carefully controlled. "Mrs. Wakefield, we need you to explain exactly how you arranged for armed mercenaries to meet your daughter at this location." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander watched his wife's face crumble as the implications hit her. "My mother really did hire people to kill us," Rain whispered. "Not just to kill you," Andrew corrected gently. "To stage your deaths in a way that would generate maximum sympathy for your families. Star-crossed lovers, destroyed by the weight of their family's sins. Very romantic. Very distracting from the real crimes." Alexander's phone buzzed with a text message. The number was unknown, but the message made his stomach drop. "Your grandfather sends his regards. Check the news." Andrew gestured to another monitor, which flickered to life showing a breaking news report. The headline read, "Billionaire heir and bride missing after FBI raid on wedding." Sources confirm that Alexander Thorne and his new wife Rain have not been seen since federal agents raided their wedding reception. Both families are cooperating with authorities, but there are growing concerns for the couple's safety. "They are setting the narrative," Alexander realized. "Making it look like we disappeared because we were guilty of something. Or because we were so distraught we took our own lives," Rain added bitterly. "Either way, we become the scapegoats for everything our families did." Andrew stood up and walked to a safe hidden behind one of the monitors. "This brings us to the real purpose of tonight's elaborate theater." He withdrew a small black box and set it on the table between them. "This contains the original evidence of your family's crimes. Not the manipulated files I gave James George, not the fabricated documents I used to lure your families into exposing themselves. The real, unaltered, prosecutable evidence." Alexander stared at the box. "What's in there?" "Video footage of your grandfather and Diana planning Caroline and Robert George's murder. Audio recordings of them discussing which other couples to target. Financial records showing payments to assassins, judges, and corrupt officials. DNA evidence from Caroline's supposed accident, that proves it was staged. Andrew's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were reading a grocery list. Enough evidence to put both families away for multiple life sentences. Rain reached for the box, but Andrew caught her wrist. There's a condition. The words hung in the air like a sword. Alexander felt his chest tighten. What condition? This evidence will only be released if both of you agree to disappear. Forever. New identities, new lives, no contact with your families or your old world. You become ghosts, and in exchange, justice is finally served. And if we refuse? Andrew smiled that serene smile that Alexander was beginning to hate. Then the evidence disappears with me, your families escape justice, and you spend the rest of your lives, however long they may be, looking over your shoulders for the next assassination attempt. Rain pulled her wrist free. You're blackmailing us into abandoning everyone we care about. I'm offering you the chance to save hundreds of innocent lives by sacrificing your privileged existence. Andrew's voice hardened. How many more Caroline and Robert Georges will your families create if they are allowed to continue? How many more young couples will die because they fell in love with someone their families deemed unacceptable? Alexander moved to one of the monitors showing a feed from the FBI field office. He could see James George in an interrogation room, his head in his hands. What happens to James? James has served his purpose. The FBI will eventually realize that much of his evidence was compromised, but by then it won't matter. Your families will have been exposed, and James will spend the rest of his life knowing he was a pawn in someone else's game. Just like we're pawns in yours. Andrew turned to face them both, and for the first time, Alexander saw something that might have been regret flicker across his features. You're casualties of war, I'll grant you that. But you're also the only ones with the power to end it permanently. Rain was studying the surveillance feeds with growing horror. That monitor, that's the medical foundation my mother runs. Why are you watching it? Andrew typed a command, and the audio from that location came online. They could hear panicked voices, people running, alarms blaring. Federal agents raided it an hour ago, Andrew explained. They found evidence that the foundation has been used to launder money for the family's illegal activities. It's being shut down permanently. No. Rain's voice was broken. That foundation provides free medical care to thousands of people. Cancer patients, pregnant women, children who can't afford treatment anywhere else. I know. It's tragic, really. But your mother should have thought of that before she used it as a front for money laundering. Alexander watched his wife's face crumble as the full scope of her mother's betrayal hit her. The woman who had raised her to believe in helping others, who had dedicated her life to serving underserved communities, had been using those very communities as cover for criminal activities. There's more, Andrew continued relentlessly. He brought up another feed showing a children's hospital. The Thorn Children's Wing, funded by your family's charitable foundation, Alexander. Also being shut down tonight. Turns out the donations that built it came from pension funds your grandfather embezzled. Alexander felt like he was drowning. How many people are losing their medical care because of what our families did? Approximately 12,000 patients across 6 facilities, Andrew replied without emotion. But that's not the worst part. He switched to a new monitor showing what appeared to be a warehouse filled with medical supplies. This is where your families have been stockpiling medications that they claimed were being donated to charity. Instead, they've been selling them on the black market at inflated prices. Including insulin, Rain whispered, reading the labels on the screen. They've been stealing insulin from diabetic children and selling it for profit. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Alexander sank into a chair, the full weight of his family's evil finally crushing him. We're not just casualties of war. We're accessories to mass murder. Not yet, Andrew said quietly. But you will be if you don't make the right choice. He opened the black box, revealing a single USB drive and a thick envelope. This contains everything needed to prosecute your families and dismantle their entire network. But it also contains something else. Andrew pulled out a photograph that made Alexander's heart stop. It showed him and Rain from earlier that evening, but they weren't alone. In the background, barely visible, was a young woman Alexander recognized from the medical foundation, someone he'd met during a charity event last year. Sophie Rake, Andrew said. Agent Rake's daughter. She's been undercover at the medical foundation for 6 months, gathering evidence for tonight's raids. Your families discovered her identity 3 hours ago. The surveillance monitor showing Agent Rake at the warehouse suddenly switched to a different feed, a young woman tied to a chair in what looked like an abandoned building. No, Alexander breathed. They are using her as leverage, Andrew explained. Your families are willing to trade her life for your disappearance. If you don't surface by dawn to take responsibility for tonight's events, she dies. Rain was staring at the screen in horror. She's just a kid. She can't be more than 25. 23. Fresh out of the FBI academy. This was her first undercover assignment. Andrew closed the box with a soft click. So you see, your choice isn't really about justice or evidence or even your own lives anymore. It's about whether you're willing to let an innocent young woman die to protect your family's secrets. Alexander's phone rang again. This time it was his grandfather's number. Answer it, Andrew instructed. Speaker phone. Harrison Thorne's voice filled the room, cold and calculating as always. Alexander, I trust you're enjoying your wedding night. Where is she, grandfather? Where's Agent Rake's daughter? Safe, for now. Though I'm afraid her continued safety depends entirely on your cooperation. Harrison's laugh was like broken glass. You see, boy, your new wife's family isn't the only one with contingency plans. We've been preparing for this possibility for years. What do you want? Simple. You and your bride present yourselves to the authorities as the masterminds behind your family's illegal activities. Two young idealists who became corrupted by greed and power. Very believable, very tragic, and very final. Alexander looked at Rain, seeing his own horror reflected in her eyes. And if we refuse? Then young Sophie Rake learns exactly how her grandmother Caroline George really died. In great detail. Over several hours. The call ended, leaving them in silence broken only by the hum of the surveillance equipment. Andrew stood up and walked to the door. I'll give you 15 minutes to decide. But understand this, whatever choice you make, there's no going back. If you agree to disappear, you save Sophie Rake but abandon everyone else your families will destroy. If you surrender to take the blame, you save your families but condemn yourselves. And if you try to fight. He paused at the door. Well, let's just say that's not really an option anymore. As the door closed behind him, Alexander and Rain found themselves alone with the weight of an impossible choice. Around them, monitors showed the destruction of everything they'd thought they were fighting for. The medical foundations closing, FBI agents questioning innocent employees, and most devastating of all, a young woman whose only crime was trying to bring justice to the world. Rain moved to the window and stared out at the city lights. We're going to lose everything, aren't we? No matter what we choose. Alexander joined her at the window, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. For a moment, they stood together in the artificial sanctuary Andrew had created, feeling more alone than either of them had ever felt in their lives. Maybe, Alexander said quietly, but we don't have to lose each other. Rain leaned back against him, and he felt some of the tension leave her body. Is this really how our story ends? A few hours of marriage before we either die or disappear forever. Maybe this isn't the end. Maybe it's just the beginning of a different story. She turned in his arms, and suddenly they were kissing, not the perfunctory kiss from the ceremony, but something desperate and real and full of everything they couldn't say out loud. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. I need you to know something, Rain whispered. Whatever happens next, these few hours with you, finding out who you really are underneath all the damage our families did to us, it's been the best part of my entire life. Alexander cupped her face in his hands, memoizing every detail. We're going to find a way through this. Together. But even as he said the words, he could see the truth in her eyes that she was too kind to voice. Sometimes love wasn't enough to overcome the sins of the past. Sometimes the people you cared about most were exactly the ones you had to sacrifice to save everyone else. And as the 15 minutes ticked away, as Sophie Rake remained tied to a chair somewhere in the darkness, as their families prepared to destroy them regardless of what choice they made, Alexander and Rain held each other and faced the terrible truth that Andrew had engineered so perfectly. There was no way out that didn't require them to lose everything that mattered. The only question left was who they were willing to save, and who they were willing to sacrifice. Including each other. The 15 minutes felt like hours. Alexander and Rain sat in the artificial sanctuary of Andrew's command center, watching helplessly as their world burned on multiple screens around them. Every monitor showed another piece of their family's empire crumbling. Medical facilities being shuttered, employees being arrested, patients being turned away from the very institutions that had been their lifelines. When Andrew returned, he wasn't alone. I thought you might want to speak with someone before making your final decision, he said, stepping aside to reveal Agent Sophie Rake. But not the composed federal agent from earlier. This was a woman on the edge of complete breakdown. "Where is she?" Rake demanded without preamble. "Where's my daughter?" Andrew gestured to the monitor, still showing the young woman tied to a chair. "Safe, for now. But Agent Rake, I think you should know, your daughter wasn't just gathering evidence about the Medical Foundation fraud." He pulled up a new file on his computer, and Sophie's undercover reports filled the screen. Alexander felt his blood chill as he read the details. "She was investigating something else," Andrew continued. "Something that makes the financial crimes look like parking tickets in comparison." Agent Rake moved closer to the screen, her face pale. "What is this?" "Your daughter discovered that the Thorne and Wakefield families haven't just been murdering interracial couples. They've been harvesting organs from their victims and selling them on the black market." Andrew's voice was clinically detached. 4 to 7 people over 20 years. Hearts, livers, kidneys, all sold to wealthy clients who didn't ask questions about the source. The room fell into stunned silence. Rain made a sound that might have been a sob or might have been her soul breaking. "That's impossible," Alexander whispered, but even as he said it, he was remembering things. His grandfather's mysterious medical trips to Switzerland. The family's sudden interest in funding organ transplant research. The private medical facility they'd built that operated with unusual secrecy. "The beautiful thing about targeting couples in love," Andrew explained with terrifying calm, "is that they are easy to isolate. One phone call about a romantic getaway, a private jet to a medical facility in international waters, and by the time anyone misses them, their organs are already in new bodies and their remains are scattered across 3 different countries." Agent Rake sank into a chair, her face gray. "How many of the victims were FBI informants?" 7. "Including your daughter's boyfriend, who was killed 3 months ago because he was getting too close to the truth about his sister's disappearance." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Alexander watched the surveillance feed of Sophie Rake tied to the chair and realized she wasn't just being held for leverage, she was being prepared for harvest. "The choice you offering us," Rain said, her voice hollow. "It was never really a choice at all, was it?" Andrew smiled. "No. You see, I need you both alive and free to serve as witnesses when this all goes to trial. But I also need your families to believe they've won, which means they need to think you're dead." He pulled out 2 syringes filled with clear liquid. "These contain a paralytic agent that will simulate death for approximately 6 hours. Enough time for your families to dispose of what they think are your bodies, while Agent Rake and I document their organ harvesting operation in real time. And Sophie," Agent Rake's voice was barely controlled, "will be rescued during the raid. But only if Alexander and Rain are willing to endure what amounts to being buried alive for 6 hours while we gather the evidence needed to destroy their families completely." Alexander stared at the syringes. "What guarantee do we have that you'll revive us?" "None whatsoever." Andrew set the syringes on the table between them. "But I will tell you this, if you refuse, Sophie Rake dies tonight, your families escape justice, and you spend the rest of your lives knowing that 4 to 7 murders will go unpunished." The monitors around them flickered, and suddenly they were seeing live feeds from inside what looked like a medical facility. Alexander recognized some of the staff, people who'd worked for his family for years, people he'd trusted. "This is happening right now," Andrew said. 3 more couples scheduled for harvest tonight. Young people who fell in love with the wrong person and trusted the wrong people when they were invited for a romantic getaway. On the screen, Alexander could see couples being led into what looked like a luxury medical spa. They were laughing, holding hands, completely unaware that they were walking to their deaths. "Stop this," Rain pleaded. "We'll do whatever you want. Just stop this." "I can't stop it. Only you can, by providing testimony that will shut down this operation permanently." Andrew checked his watch. "But the window is closing. Your families are expecting your bodies to arrive at the facility within the hour." Agent Rake stood up abruptly. "I'm calling this in. SWAT team, federal marshals, whatever it takes." "With what evidence?" "The files James George provided that turned out to be compromised. The testimony of a grief-stricken mother who will be dismissed as unreliable." Andrew shook his head. "By the time you convince anyone to take action, Sophie will be dead, those 3 couples will be dead, and your families will have disappeared to countries without extradition treaties." Alexander's phone buzzed with a video message. The sender was his grandfather, and the timestamp showed it was recorded just minutes ago. The video showed Sophie Rake, no longer tied to a chair but lying on what was unmistakably an operating table. She was conscious but paralyzed, her eyes wide with terror as masked figures prepared surgical instruments around her. "Tick-tock, Alexander," Harrison Thorne's voice narrated over the footage. "Your bride's deadline is approaching, and young Sophie here is about to make a very generous donation to medical science. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to take her place." The video ended. In the silence that followed, Alexander could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. "His bluffing," Agent Rake said, but her voice lacked conviction. "He wouldn't actually." Another video arrived. This one showed the three couples Andrew had mentioned, now being sedated and prepped for surgery. Alexander recognized one of the young men, a college student who'd worked as an intern at the Thorne Foundation last summer. "They are children," Rain whispered. "They are all just children." Andrew picked up one of the syringes. "The paralytic works within seconds. You'll remain conscious but unable to move or speak. Your breathing and heart rate will slow to undetectable levels. To anyone checking, you'll appear completely dead. And if something goes wrong, if you can't revive us..." Alexander's voice was hoarse. "Then you die as heroes instead of living as cowards. But I prefer successful operations to martyrs." Andrew held out the syringe to Alexander. "Who goes first?" Alexander reached for the syringe, but Rain caught his wrist. "Wait. If we do this, if we survive this, what happens to us? Do we get to stay together?" The question hung in the air like a prayer. Andrew looked between them, and for the first time since this nightmare began, his expression softened slightly. "That depends entirely on whether you can forgive each other for what you're about to go through." "What do you mean?" "The plan requires one of you to watch the other die and react convincingly to the trauma. One of you will know the other is alive. One of you will believe they've lost everything." Andrew's voice was gentle but implacable. "That kind of psychological trauma, it changes people. It breaks trust in ways that can never be fully repaired." Alexander felt the world tilt. "You're asking one of us to torture the other. I'm asking you to save 6 lives tonight and hundreds more in the future. The cost of that salvation is the knowledge that your love story might not survive the telling." Rain took the syringe from Alexander's hands. "I'll go first." "No." Alexander tried to take it back, but she stepped away. "You're stronger than I am, Alex. You'll be able to handle watching and staying in character. I'm not sure I could do the same." "Rain, please." "Besides," she said with a broken smile, "I've spent my whole life watching the people I love disappear. At least this time I'll know there's hope for a resurrection." Before Alexander could stop her, she plunged the needle into her arm and pressed the plunger. The effect was almost instantaneous. Her eyes widened, then went glassy, her breathing became shallow, and she collapsed to the floor. "Rain!" Alexander dropped to his knees beside her, even though he knew she couldn't respond. Her skin was already growing cold to the touch, her pulse so faint he could barely detect it. "Very convincing," Andrew observed. "Now we need to get her body to your grandfather's facility before the paralytic wears off. You'll ride in the transport vehicle and provide the necessary emotional breakdown when they examine her." Alexander looked down at his wife's lifeless face and felt something inside him shatter. Even knowing she was alive, even understanding this was theater, the sight of her still form was devastating. "I can't do this." "You have to. Look at the monitors, Alexander. Look at Sophie Rake. Look at those 3 couples. Count the lives that depend on your performance in the next 6 hours." Alexander forced himself to look at the screens showing the organ harvesting facility. On one monitor, Sophie was being wheeled into surgery. On another, the 3 couples were being separated and prepared for different procedures. In real time, he was watching people die because of his family's greed. "Help me carry her," he said, his voice breaking. As they lifted Rain's seemingly lifeless body, Andrew spoke quietly in his ear. "Remember, Alexander, the key to surviving this is holding on to the truth that she's coming back. But you also need to grieve authentically. The people who examine her body are experts at detecting deception." They carried her to a specially prepared transport van that looked like a medical examiner's vehicle. As Alexander climbed into the back beside her body, Andrew handed him an earpiece. "I'll be monitoring everything. When it's time for the raid, you'll know." The van doors closed, leaving Alexander alone with his wife's still form as they drove through the night toward a facility where his family would confirm her death and prepare to dispose of her body, never knowing they were delivering evidence that would destroy them. As the city lights flashed past the windows, Alexander held Rain's cold hand and whispered promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "I'll get you out of this. I'll save Sophie. I'll stop them all. And when this is over, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to sacrifice yourself for anyone ever again." But even as he spoke the words, Alexander knew the terrible truth Andrew had been trying to prepare him for. Some sacrifices change you so fundamentally that even if you survive them, you never really come back from them. And as the van approached the facility where his family performed their most heinous crimes, Alexander wondered if the people they would be when this nightmare ended would even recognize the couple who had fallen in love during the darkest day of their lives. The van pulled up to what looked like an exclusive medical retreat nestled in the mountains outside the city. Alexander had been here before: family gatherings, board meetings, charity events. He'd always assumed it was exactly what it appeared to be: a luxury recovery facility for wealthy clients seeking privacy during medical procedures. Now, seeing it through the lens of what he knew about his family's crimes, every detail took on a sinister meaning. The high walls weren't for privacy, they were for containing screams. The separate entrance for special clients wasn't for discretion, it was for body disposal. "Remember," Andrew's voice crackled through the earpiece, "complete emotional breakdown. Make them believe you're destroyed by grief." The van doors opened, and Alexander found himself face to face with Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the facility's chief medical officer. She was a woman he'd known since childhood, someone who'd treated his scraped knees and given him lollipops after checkups. Seeing her now, knowing what she'd become part of, felt like discovering his own mother was a serial killer. "Alexander, my dear boy," Dr. Reeves said, her voice filled with practiced sympathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Such a tragic accident." "Accident?" Alexander's voice cracked authentically. The word tasted like poison in his mouth. "A car crash, from what I understand. She was thrown from the vehicle. The trauma was extensive." Dr. Reeves gestured to two orderlies who began transferring Rain's still form to a gurney. "We'll take excellent care of her, I promise." Alexander watched them wheel his wife's body through the facility's corridors, past rooms he now realized were operating theaters designed for butchery rather than healing. Through an open doorway, he glimpsed surgical equipment that looked more like torture devices than medical instruments. "Where is she?" he demanded suddenly. "Where's Sophie Rake?" Dr. Reeves's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. "I'm not sure what you mean, dear." "The FBI agent's daughter. I know she's here. I know what you're doing to her." "Alexander, you're clearly in shock. Perhaps you should sit down. I want to see her. Now." Dr. Reeves studied his face for a long moment, then seemed to reach a decision. "Very well. But I think you should understand exactly what kind of world you've inherited before you make any demands." She led him deeper into the facility, past rooms where Alexander could hear the quiet hum of machinery and the occasional muffled sound that might have been crying. Finally, she stopped at a reinforced door with a small window. "Look inside," she instructed. Alexander peered through the glass and felt his soul die a little. Sophie Rake was indeed on an operating table, but she wasn't alone. The three couples Andrew had shown him on the monitors were there too, along with several other young people Alexander didn't recognize. All of them were conscious but paralyzed, their eyes wide with terror as medical staff prepared them for procedures that would end their lives. "Your grandfather's orders were very specific," Dr. Reeves said conversationally. "Miss Rake dies first, as an example. Then the others, in order of their perceived threat to family security. We've become quite efficient at the process." "You're talking about murder." "I'm talking about survival. Do you know how much a healthy heart sells for on the private market? $2 million. A liver, $1.5 million. Kidneys are practically pocket change at $400,000 each." Dr. Reeves smiled. "Your family's humanitarian work has been quite profitable." Alexander felt bile rise in his throat. These are people. They have families, dreams, futures. They had those things. Now they have something more important. They have the opportunity to serve a greater good. Their deaths fund medical research, provide organs to wealthy donors who can afford to pay, and eliminate threats to social stability. The casual evil in her voice was more horrifying than any scream. This wasn't a monster. This was a person who'd convinced herself that mass murder was a public service. "The Rake girl goes first in approximately 10 minutes, Dr. Reeves continued. "Heart, liver, kidneys, corneas. We have buyers lined up for everything. Would you like to watch? Your grandfather thought it might be educational." Alexander's earpiece crackled to life. "Alexander, listen to me very carefully. The facility is surrounded, but we can't move until we have documented evidence of active crimes. You need to get them to begin the procedure while recording everything." The request hit him like a physical blow. Andrew was asking him to watch Sophie Rake be murdered so they could build a legal case. "I can't," he whispered. "What was that, dear?" Dr. Reeves asked. Alexander's mind raced. He thought about the little boy who'd fallen into the lake 20 years ago, about the girl who'd saved him, about the promises he'd made to become someone better. He thought about Rain lying motionless in a room somewhere in this facility, trusting him to save not just her but everyone else their families had marked for death. "I said I want to watch," Alexander said, his voice stronger now. "But first, I want to understand the full scope of the operation. How many people have you killed?" Dr. Reeves's smile widened. "Oh, Alexander, I think you're going to fit into this family business beautifully." She led him to her office, where the walls were lined with photographs. At first glance, they looked like memorial photos, couples smiling at cameras, families celebrating holidays, young people at graduations. But as Alexander looked closer, he realized what he was seeing, a trophy wall of victims. 4 to 7 successful procedures over the past 20 years, Dr. Reeves said proudly. Each one personally selected by your grandfather and Mrs. Wakefield for maximum social benefit. Interracial couples, primarily, though we've expanded to include other, undesirable pairings. Alexander forced himself to study the photographs, memorizing faces, committing every detail to memory. What made them undesirable? Different races, different social classes, different religions. Your grandfather has very specific ideas about genetic purity and social stability. These couples represented threats to the natural order. Dr. Reeves pulled out a thick file. But the real breakthrough came 5 years ago when we began targeting couples where one partner had useful professional connections. She opened the file to reveal surveillance photos of FBI agents, prosecutors, journalists, civil rights lawyers, all with notes about their romantic relationships and how those relationships could be exploited. We discovered that nothing destroys an idealistic prosecutor quite like the mysterious disappearance of their beloved. They either abandon their cases to search for their missing partners, or they become so emotionally compromised they are removed from sensitive investigations. Alexander's hands shook as he flipped through the files. Names, faces, detailed plans for destroying people whose only crime was falling in love with someone while working to make the world more just. The Rake girl's mother has been investigating financial crimes in the pharmaceutical industry, Dr. Reeves continued. Very inconvenient for several of our clients. With her daughter gone, Agent Rake will either drop the investigation or become so consumed with grief that she'll make mistakes that discredit her work. Through the office window, Alexander could see into the operating theater where Sophie Rake waited. Medical staff were setting up equipment, preparing instruments, adjusting cameras that would presumably record her death for the buyers who'd purchased her organs. "Actually," Dr. Reeves said, checking her watch, "we should head back. The procedure begins in 3 minutes. And your grandfather specifically wanted you to witness this one. He thinks it will help you understand your role in the family legacy." Alexander's earpiece crackled again. "Federal agents are in position. The moment they begin cutting, we raid. You need to keep them talking, keep documenting everything they say." As they walked back toward the operating theater, Alexander caught a glimpse of another room through an open doorway. Rain's body lay on a table, still and pale, while technicians prepared equipment around her. Even knowing she was alive, the sight nearly broke his composure. "Ah yes, your tragic bride." Dr. Reeves noticed his gaze. "We'll begin harvesting her organs once we finish with the Rake girl. Such a waste, really. She was quite beautiful. But at least her death will serve the greater good." "Wait." The word came out before Alexander could stop himself. What if she wasn't dead?" Dr. Reeves paused. "What do you mean?" Alexander's mind raced. He had seconds to make a choice that would determine not just Rain's fate, but the fate of everyone in this facility. If he revealed that Rain was alive, Andrew's plan would be exposed. But if he didn't, he'd have to watch his wife be butchered while she was conscious but paralyzed. I mean, what if we could use her differently? Instead of just harvesting organs, what if we made her disappearance educational? Dr. Reeves's eyes lit up with interest. "Go on. She's from a prominent family. Her disappearance will generate media attention. What if we let that attention work for us? Stage her death as a suicide, make it look like she couldn't handle the shame of her family's crimes. It would discredit the entire investigation." "Interesting. But the organ buyers are expecting delivery. Find other sources. There are plenty of homeless people, addicts, undocumented immigrants who won't be missed." "But Rain," She's worth more as a symbol than as parts. Alexander hated every word coming out of his mouth, hated the way Dr. Reeves nodded approvingly, hated himself for sounding exactly like the kind of monster he'd been raised to become. But it was working. She was reconsidering Rain's immediate execution. I'll need to call your grandfather, Dr. Reeves decided. This represents a significant change in plans. As she reached for her phone, alarms suddenly began blaring throughout the facility. Emergency lights flashed red, and the sound of shattering glass echoed from multiple directions. Federal agents. Nobody move. The raid had begun. Through the chaos, Alexander heard Dr. Reeves screaming orders. Begin all procedures immediately. Destroy the evidence. Kill them all. Alexander ran toward the operating theater where Sophie Rake waited, his earpiece filled with Andrew's urgent voice. Get to Rain. The paralytic will be wearing off, but she'll be disoriented and vulnerable. The corridors had become a war zone. Federal agents in tactical gear were moving through the facility, but the medical staff were following Dr. Reeves's orders. Rather than surrender, they were trying to complete their murders and destroy evidence. Alexander burst into the room where Rain lay. A technician was approaching her table with a scalpel, preparing to begin the harvesting procedure. Without thinking, Alexander tackled the man, sending them both crashing into a table of surgical instruments. Rain! He shook her shoulders desperately. Rain, wake up! Her eyelids fluttered, and he saw awareness beginning to return to her gaze. She tried to speak but couldn't yet control her vocal cords. It's okay, Alexander whispered, gathering her into his arms. I've got you. You're safe. But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't true. Gunshots echoed from other parts of the facility. People were screaming. And somewhere in this nightmare, Sophie Rake and the other victims were still fighting for their lives. Rain's hand weakly gripped his shirt, and she managed to whisper, "The others, save the others." Alexander looked into his wife's eyes and saw something that broke his heart. Even after everything she'd endured, even knowing she'd nearly been butchered alive, her first thought was for people she'd never met. In that moment, staring at the woman who'd saved his life as a child and was still trying to save lives as an adult, Alexander finally understood what it meant to love someone more than yourself. He kissed her forehead and whispered, "Stay here. I'll be right back." Then he ran toward the sound of gunfire and screaming, toward the operating theater where Sophie Rake waited, toward a choice that would either save them all or destroy everything. Because sometimes loving someone meant leaving them behind to save strangers. And sometimes becoming the person you were meant to be required walking into hell with your eyes wide open. Alexander burst into the operating theater to find chaos. Federal agents were attempting to secure the room while medical staff destroyed equipment and files. Sophie Rake remained on the operating table, conscious but paralyzed, a surgeon standing over her with a scalpel raised, not to save her life, but to end it before she could testify. "Stop!" Alexander lunged forward, tackling the surgeon just as the blade began its descent. They crashed into a bank of monitoring equipment, sending sparks and alarms cascading through the room. Agent Rake appeared in the doorway, her weapon drawn, her face a mask of controlled fury as she saw her daughter on the table. "Sophie, baby, I'm here." But as Alexander rolled away from the unconscious surgeon, he saw something that made his blood freeze. Dr. Reeves was standing behind Agent Rake with a syringe, preparing to inject something into her neck. "Behind you!" Alexander shouted. Agent Rake spun and fired in one fluid motion. Dr. Reeves dropped to the floor, the syringe rolling away across the tiles. But her last words echoed through the chaos. "The countdown has already started. 60 seconds. "What countdown?" Alexander demanded, but Dr. Reeves was beyond answering. Andrew's voice crackled through Alexander's earpiece. "The entire facility is wired with explosives. Your family's final contingency plan. If they can't escape justice, they'll destroy all the evidence and everyone in it." Alexander looked around the operating theater. Sophie Rake was still paralyzed on the table. 3 other victims lay on nearby tables, all conscious but unable to move. Agent Rake was trying to lift her daughter, but Sophie was dead weight in her arms. "How long until the paralytic wears off?" Alexander asked into his earpiece. "At least 30 minutes. You need to evacuate them now." 4 to 5 seconds. Agent Rake called out, reading something on Dr. Reeves's dropped tablet. "We have 4 to 5 seconds to get everyone out." Through the reinforced windows, Alexander could see federal agents evacuating other parts of the facility, carrying victims who couldn't walk. But there were too many people and not enough time. Then Rain appeared in the doorway, still unsteady on her feet but determined. How many? She asked simply. 7 victims, all paralyzed, Alexander replied. 40 seconds. Rain nodded and grabbed a gurney. Then we carry them all. What followed was the longest 38 seconds of Alexander's life. He and Rain worked with desperate efficiency, loading paralyzed victims onto gurneys while Agent Rake coordinated with other federal agents. No one spoke about the impossibility of evacuating 7 people in under a minute. They simply moved. Alexander found himself carrying a young man who couldn't have been older than 25, his eyes wide with terror but filled with gratitude. As they ran through the facility's corridors, Alexander whispered, "You're going to be okay. I promise you're going to be okay." They reached the facility's main entrance just as Alexander's earpiece erupted with static. 15 seconds. Everyone clear the building. Alexander looked back to see Rain still inside, struggling with the last gurney. A young woman, barely more than a teenager, lay motionless as Rain tried to maneuver the heavy bed through the doorway. "Rain, leave her. There's no time." "No." Rain's voice carried absolute conviction. "We don't leave anyone behind." Alexander set down the victim he was carrying and ran back into the building. Together, he and Rain lifted the gurney and ran toward the exit as alarms screamed around them. They cleared the doorway with 3 seconds to spare. The explosion that followed was unlike anything Alexander had ever experienced. Not just the physical force that threw them all to the ground, but the psychological impact of watching 50 years of his family's evil literally go up in flames. As debris rained down around them, as sirens wailed in the distance, as paramedics rushed to treat the victims they'd saved, Alexander found himself lying in the grass next to Rain, both of them covered in dust and blood but alive. "Is everyone okay?" Rain asked, struggling to sit up. Alexander looked around at the victims they'd rescued. Paramedics were checking vital signs, starting fours, providing care. Sophie Rake was conscious and speaking to her mother in a voice that was weak but clear. The young man Alexander had carried was gripping a paramedic's hand and crying with relief. "Everyone's alive," Alexander confirmed. "We got them all." But even as he said it, he realized something was wrong. Andrew was nowhere to be seen. Agent Rake approached them, her face grim despite the successful rescue. "We have a problem. We've arrested 17 staff members, but Harrison Thorne and Diana Wakefield weren't here. They escaped before the raid began." Alexander felt his heart sink. "Where are they?" "Unknown. But there's something else." Agent Rake held up a tablet showing surveillance footage. "This was recorded 20 minutes ago at a private airfield. Your grandfather and Rain's mother boarding a jet with several other individuals." The footage was grainy, but Alexander could make out faces. His grandfather, Diana Wakefield, and several other people he recognized as family friends and business associates. But there was someone else, someone whose presence made Alexander's blood run cold. "That's Andrew," Rain whispered. "But he's not their prisoner. He's leading them." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Andrew wasn't their rescuer. He wasn't even their manipulator. He was their family's partner. Agent Rake enhanced the audio from the surveillance footage, and Andrew's voice came through clearly. "The facility has served its purpose. The children have been properly traumatized, the evidence has been eliminated, and we have enough documented heroism to make them sympathetic figures for the media. Phase 3 is complete." Alexander stared at the screen as his entire understanding of the night's events crumbled. Phase 3. The recording continued. Alexander and Rain now believe themselves to be heroes who saved innocent lives. They'll testify willingly about what they witnessed, never suspecting that every victim in that facility was a paid actor and every organ harvesting procedure was elaborate theater. The words hit like bullets. Alexander looked around at the victims they'd rescued, people he'd risked his life to save, people whose terror had seemed so real. "The paralytic drug wasn't paralytic," Agent Rake said quietly. "It was a mild sedative combined with a muscle relaxant. Everyone in that facility was conscious and aware the entire time, but they were all performing roles." Rain's face had gone white. The explosions. Controlled demolitions designed to destroy the fake evidence while creating the appearance of desperate criminals covering their tracks. Agent Rake's voice was hollow. "There never was an organ harvesting operation. It was all theater designed to make you both believe you were heroes while actually serving as witnesses to crimes that never happened." Alexander felt reality fracturing around him. But the families that were murdered, Caroline and Robert George, were very real, as was their son James, who was indeed manipulated into seeking revenge. But Andrew isn't Caroline's brother. He's Harrison Thorne's nephew, planted 50 years ago to eventually orchestrate exactly this scenario. The surveillance footage continued playing, showing Andrew embracing Harrison Thorne like a beloved family member. "You see," Andrew's recorded voice explained to the assembled group, "the real crimes, the murders, the financial fraud, the discrimination, were all committed by a shadow network that includes dozens of families across multiple industries. The Thornes and Wakefields were always meant to be scapegoats, prominent enough to satisfy public demands for justice while protecting the real power structure." Alexander sank to his knees in the grass, the full scope of the manipulation finally clear. "We were never fighting them. We were working for them. Every choice you made tonight," Agent Rake continued reading from Andrew's transmission, "was carefully orchestrated to produce this exact outcome. Alexander and Rain believe they've exposed their family's crimes and saved innocent lives. They'll testify enthusiastically about what they witnessed. The public will be satisfied that justice has been served. And the real network will continue operating with even better security." Rain stood up abruptly, her face blazing with fury. "The medical foundations that were shut down will reopen under new management in 6 months, with increased public support because of the heroic actions that exposed the corruption in their previous administration. The people losing medical care were relocated to other facilities owned by the same shadow network. No one actually lost access to treatment. They just lost access to independently operated treatment." Alexander looked at the victims they'd rescued, people whose terror had seemed so genuine, whose gratitude had felt so real. How many of them knew? All of them. They are professional actors, many of whom have worked for intelligence agencies in the past. "The young woman you carried, Alexander? She's actually a 35-year-old former CIA operative. Sophie Rake's boyfriend who was supposedly murdered. He's alive and well, working security for one of Andrew's shell companies." The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that Alexander couldn't process it. Every moment of heroism, every act of love, every sacrifice they'd made had been orchestrated by the very people they thought they were fighting. But as he knelt in the grass, surrounded by the wreckage of his entire understanding of reality, Alexander felt Rain's hand slip into his. "It doesn't matter," she said quietly. "What?" "It doesn't matter that they were actors. It doesn't matter that the danger was fake. It doesn't matter that we were manipulated." Rain's voice grew stronger. "What matters is who we chose to be when we thought lives were at stake." Alexander looked up at his wife, seeing something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, not innocence lost, but wisdom gained. "We chose to save people we thought were strangers," she continued. "We chose to risk our lives for people we'd never met. We chose love over fear, sacrifice over safety. Those choices were real, even if everything else was theater." Agent Rake was still reading from Andrew's transmission. "The final phase requires Alexander and Rain to be discredited before they can cause real damage. Evidence will be planted suggesting they were willing participants in their family's crimes, effectively silencing them permanently." But as sirens approached in the distance, real sirens this time, carrying real federal agents responding to Agent Rake's authentic distress call, Alexander realized something that Andrew hadn't anticipated. The recordings they'd made throughout the night, the conversations they'd witnessed, the evidence they'd gathered, all of it was authentic documentation of a real conspiracy, even if the specific crimes they'd witnessed were staged. "Rake," Alexander said, standing up. "How much of tonight's events did you record?" "Everything. Body cameras, audio surveillance, digital evidence collection, it's all documented. Including Andrew's confession about the shadow network." Agent Rake smiled for the first time since the nightmare began. "Every word." As federal vehicles surrounded the area and real agents moved to secure the scene, as Andrew's elaborate deception began unraveling under the weight of his own hubris, Alexander and Rain stood together and faced a truth that no amount of manipulation could change. They had become exactly the people they were meant to be, not because of their family's influence, but in spite of it. The war was far from over. Andrew and their families were still free, still dangerous, still capable of causing tremendous harm. But for the first time in their lives, Alexander and Rain were fighting on the right side, with real allies, armed with the truth. And sometimes, the truth really was enough to change everything. 6 months later, Alexander stood in the same chapel where their nightmare had begun, but everything was different. Gone were the 300 society guests and elaborate floral arrangements. Instead, 27 people filled the simple wooden pews, FBI agents who'd worked the case, former victims of the shadow network, medical professionals who'd lost their jobs when corrupt facilities were exposed, and a few genuine friends they'd discovered along the way. At the altar, Rain waited for him in a simple white dress she'd bought herself, her face radiant with a joy that no amount of money or manipulation could fabricate. This time, Alexander knew her name. This time, he knew her heart. This time, he was choosing her not because lawyers had arranged it, but because she was the person who'd taught him what it meant to be human. Nervous? James George asked, appearing at Alexander's elbow. The real James George, not the grief-stricken son they'd thought they'd known, but a seasoned FBI investigator who'd spent 5 years building a case against the Shadow Network. Not nervous, Alexander replied, adjusting the simple silver cufflinks Rain had given him. Nothing like the platinum ones that had symbolized his family's corruption. Grateful. Any word from the prosecution team? Alexander nodded toward Agent Rake, who was sitting in the front row with her daughter Sophie. The real Sophie Rake, it turned out, was indeed an FBI agent, but she'd volunteered for the undercover operation that had finally brought down Andrew and his network. 17 convictions so far, including Andrew and my grandfather. Diana got 15 years for conspiracy. The Shadow Network is dismantled. And the medical foundations reopened under independent oversight. The real patients who were affected during the transition have been compensated and relocated to legitimate facilities. Alexander paused. There's actually a waiting list of doctors who want to work at the new facilities. Turns out a lot of medical professionals were just waiting for the chance to practice real medicine instead of serving as cover for money laundering. The chapel doors opened, and Victoria walked in, her arm linked with a woman Alexander had never met, Dr. Martinez, the new director of one of the rebuilt medical foundations. His sister had spent the past 6 months working to repair the damage their family had caused, and in the process had found both love and purpose. Ready? Victoria asked, taking her place as his best man. It had been Rain's idea. She wanted the wedding party to reflect who they were now, not who tradition expected them to be. Alexander looked down the aisle at his bride, remembering another moment 6 months ago when he'd walked this same path filled with fear and prejudice. The man who had whispered, "I hope she's not black," was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love wasn't about race or class or family expectations. It was about choosing to see someone else's heart and deciding to honor it with your own. The ceremony was officiated by Father Miguel, a priest who ran a sanctuary for undocumented immigrants that Alexander and Rain now funded anonymously. His words were simple but profound. Marriage is not about becoming the same person, but about becoming better people together. When they reached the vows they'd written themselves, Alexander's voice was steady and clear. Rain, you saved my life when I was 8 years old, and you've been saving it ever since. Not from drowning in a lake, but from drowning in the hatred and fear I was taught to carry. You've shown me that love isn't something you fall into. It's something you choose, every day, even when the world tells you that choice is wrong. Rain's vows were equally heartfelt. Alexander, you could have chosen to stay the person your family made you. Instead, you chose to become the person you were meant to be. You've shown me that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about refusing to let the past define your future. I choose you, not despite your journey, but because of where it's brought you. When they kissed this time, it wasn't the tentative, fearful kiss of their arranged wedding. It was the kiss of two people who had walked through hell together and chosen to build heaven on the other side. The reception was held in the community center of the neighborhood where they now lived, not the mansions of their birth, but a diverse area where their neighbors included teachers and artists and small business owners who judged them by their actions rather than their inheritance. Any regrets? Rain asked as they swayed together during their first dance to a song by a local jazz trio they'd discovered at the farmer's market. Alexander looked around the room at the faces surrounding them, people who'd chosen to be here not for social advancement but for genuine affection. Only one. What's that? I regret that it took me 28 years to become someone worthy of you. Rain smiled, the same smile that had comforted a frightened 8-year-old in a park long ago. The beautiful thing about redemption is that it's never too late to start. As the evening progressed, Alexander found himself in conversation with Dr. Sophie Rake, who'd become a close friend in the months since the investigation concluded. How's the new foundation work? She asked. Overwhelming in the best possible way, Alexander replied. We're processing applications for medical care from families who've been without options for years. The demand is. He shook his head. It's staggering how many people have been failed by the system. That's what happens when healthcare becomes a commodity instead of a right, Sophie agreed. But what you and Rain are building, Independent clinics, sliding scale payments, no questions asked about immigration status. It's revolutionary. Alexander watched Rain across the room, deep in conversation with a young mother whose daughter had received life-saving heart surgery through their foundation. She's the revolutionary. I'm just trying to keep up. Don't sell yourself short. The Alexander Thorne who testified before Congress last month, who called out institutional racism in healthcare funding by name, who refused to accept immunity in exchange for his testimony. That man is pretty revolutionary too. The congressional testimony had been the hardest thing Alexander had ever done. Standing before cameras and representatives, admitting not just his family's crimes but his own complicity in racist thinking, acknowledging the damage that generational wealth and privilege had allowed them to inflict. But it had also been liberating, the final severing of ties to a legacy he'd never chosen and never wanted. Mr. and Mrs. Thorne. A young man approached them, someone Alexander didn't recognize but who carried himself with the careful politeness of someone asking for help. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to thank you. For what? Rain asked, joining the conversation. My boyfriend and I, we were one of the couples your families targeted 3 years ago. Not for the fake organ harvesting, but the real harassment. Death threats, getting us fired from our jobs, having our apartment lease mysteriously terminated. The young man's voice was steady, but Alexander could see the cost of what he was describing. We almost broke up because the pressure was so intense. But when your testimony came out, when the whole network was exposed, suddenly all the harassment stopped. We're getting married next month. Alexander felt the familiar weight of his family's legacy, but this time it was balanced by something else. The possibility of repair, of making amends, of building something better from the wreckage. Would you like us to come to your wedding? Rain asked suddenly. Not as charity or publicity, just as friends celebrating love. The young man's face lit up. Really? That would be, yes. Yes, we'd be honored. As the reception wound down, Alexander and Rain found themselves on the community center's small balcony, looking out over a neighborhood that was nothing like the wealthy enclaves where they'd been raised but felt more like home than anywhere they'd ever lived. Agent Rake called earlier, Rain said quietly. They found 3 more families who were targeted by the network. All of them are getting counseling and financial support, but trauma doesn't disappear just because justice is served, Alexander finished. How do we live with that? Knowing that our family's crimes have consequences we'll never be able to fully repair. Rain leaned against him, solid and warm and real. We live with it by making sure it never happens again. By building something better. By choosing love every day until love becomes stronger than hate. Alexander's phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. Channel 7 wants to interview you both about the new clinic opening. Should I set it up? Alexander showed the message to Rain, who shook her head. Not yet. Maybe never. The work is more important than the publicity. Even if publicity means more funding. There are other ways to get funding. Ways that don't require us to perform our redemption for cameras. Rain smiled. Besides, the most powerful change happens quietly, one person at a time. As if summoned by her words, a car pulled up outside the community center. An older black woman got out, walked to the building's entrance, and rang the bell. Alexander recognized her immediately, Mrs. Daniels, whose grandson had been one of the victims of the real harassment network. Mrs. Daniels. Rain called down from the balcony. Is everything okay? Child, I just wanted to say thank you. My grandson Andrew, not the monster who used his name, but my real grandson, he started college this week. Full scholarship to study medicine. She looked up at them with tears in her eyes. For the first time in 3 years, he's not afraid to walk across campus holding his boyfriend's hand. After Mrs. Daniels left, Alexander and Rain sat in comfortable silence, watching the neighborhood settle into the evening. Children played in small front yards while their parents sat on stoops, talking and laughing. It was a scene of simple, radical normalcy. People of different backgrounds sharing space and building community together. Do you think we'll ever stop feeling guilty? Alexander asked. I hope not, Rain replied. Not completely. Guilt keeps us honest. It keeps us working. It keeps us human. And do you think we'll ever stop being afraid? That someone else like Andrew will come along? That our family's influence will reach out from prison somehow? Rain considered this. Probably not. But fear keeps us vigilant. And we're not facing it alone anymore. She was right. Over the past 6 months, they'd built a network of their own, not for power or control, but for protection and support. Former FBI agents who'd worked the case, doctors committed to ethical medicine, lawyers who specialized in protecting victims of organized crime, activists who'd been fighting systems of oppression long before Alexander and Rain joined the battle. James called earlier too, Alexander said. The real James. There's another family in Seattle that might need help. Parents who adopted transracially and are being harassed by some organization that claims to be about family purity. Not the Shadow Network. No, something new. Or maybe something old that we just haven't uncovered yet. Alexander sighed. It never really ends, does it? No, Rain agreed. But that's not a reason to stop fighting. It's a reason to keep going. As they prepared to leave, Alexander caught sight of his reflection in the community center's glass doors. The man looking back at him bore little resemblance to the frightened, prejudiced heir who'd stood before an altar 6 months ago hoping his bride wouldn't be black. This man's eyes held compassion instead of fear, strength instead of entitlement, love instead of hate. Ready to go home? Rain asked, taking his hand. Alexander looked at their intertwined fingers, her dark skin against his pale skin, their wedding rings catching the light, their hands fitting together perfectly despite everything the world had tried to teach them about who they were supposed to love. Ready, he said. They walked together toward the car that would take them to their modest apartment in a neighborhood their families would have considered beneath them, to a life built on love instead of legacy, to a future they were writing together one choice at a time. Behind them, the community center's lights dimmed but didn't go dark. It would be open again tomorrow for the free clinic hours, for the ESL classes, for the support groups that served the people their families had tried so hard to ignore or eliminate. And ahead of them, the city sprawled out in all its beautiful, messy diversity. Millions of people falling in love across every line that society tried to draw between them, proving again and again that love was stronger than fear, that community was stronger than control, that hope was stronger than hate. The war against prejudice and oppression would continue long after Alexander and Rain were gone. But they'd learned something their families never understood. You don't fight that war by accumulating power over others. You fight it by choosing love, one person at a time, one day at a time, one small act of courage at a time. And sometimes, that's enough to change the world. As they drove through the night toward home, Alexander's last thought before falling asleep against Rain's shoulder was the same prayer he'd whispered every night for 6 months. Thank you for teaching me that the person I was afraid to become was actually the person I was always meant to be. What did this story teach you about the power of love to transform not just individuals, but entire systems of oppression? How can we recognize when our own prejudices are being used to divide us from people who might become our greatest allies? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world.